As we move into our group of lessons on the upper limb, let's first give some kudos to this amazing appendage. I think many people would agree that the upper extremity is absolutely foundational to so much of our humanity. I mean, your dog can't pick up a spoon, a horse can't use a keyboard, your cat can't play the piano, and your goldfish or canary, well, there's really no comparison between our upper limb and a fin or a wing. Of course, those appendages do have their own advantages in their own environments. But even if any of those animals had the brains and language abilities that we have, they simply do not have the manual dexterity. During our human evolution, the upper limb already had the prehensile or grasping thumb that's characteristic of primates. That's the order that includes prosimians, monkeys, apes, and humans. But in the hominid line leading to us, our adaptation to bipedal locomotion freed our upper limbs, disconnecting them from our ambulation. In conjunction with our increasingly larger brain, this bipedalism, combined with our remarkable upper limb, allowed us to explore, exploit, manipulate, and grasp, figuratively as well as literally, the world around us. Now, it occurs to me that as an introduction to the upper limb, this lesson about the brachial plexus is a presentation that you may either likely love or, shall we say, not love, depending on whether you enjoy learning about the nervous system and appreciate cool nuances and details. Now, I really like detail and organizational patterns, so the brachial plexus is one of my favorite aspects of musculoskeletal anatomy. This brachial plexus will set the stage for the study of the upper limb, since it takes us from the innervation of upper limb muscles of the shoulder all the way down to the muscles that control the fingers. In addition, the brachial plexus takes nearly all of the sensations of the upper limb to the central nervous system for perception. Now, you may recall that plexus is Latin for braid or plate. The brachial plexus is a braided network of 5 ventral rami, starting with the 5th cervical nerve, also known as C5, and down to the ventral ramus of the 1st thoracic nerve, known as T1. We've said the ventral rami of thoracic spinal nerves can be intercostal nerves, or they can engage in a plexus. One of the thoracic nerves, T1, does both. Part of it hugs the first rib as the first intercostal nerve, but the rest of it enters into the brachial plexus to help supply the upper limb. In an earlier lesson, we learned that there are 8 cervical nerves. C5 comes out above or superior to the 5th cervical vertebra, the C6 nerve above the 6th cervical vertebra, C7 above the last cervical vertebra, and C8 below or inferior to the C7 vertebra. Then, from the 1st thoracic nerve on down, all spinal nerves, except the sacral nerves and coccygeal nerve, come out below their bone of the same number. So the final nerve that contributes to the brachial plexus, T1, emerges from below the 1st thoracic vertebra. But either because it's more complex than any other plexus of the somatic nervous system, or because it is seemingly more integral to our humanity and day-to-day tasks, the brachial plexus braiding itself is broken down into regional subcomponents. From proximal to distal, parts of the brachial plexus braiding are referred to as roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches. All this complexity occurs in the root of the neck in the relatively protected anatomical region known clinically as the axilla, but commonly called the armpit. Now, we won't go into this much detail with all plexuses, but the nervous system is fascinating, and the brachial plexus is one place where we can really dig in to help illustrate the complexity and importance of the nervous system to musculoskeletal anatomy. And rather than kicking us off, or should I say pitching in, since we're talking about the upper limb, with a clinical vignette, we'll learn about the brachial plexus and then weave in a few pathologies later in this lesson. In previous lessons, I've used some mnemonic devices to help you remember a series of items or concepts. You've probably heard others before, like Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, or every good boy does fine for the notes on the musical scale. But in the sciences, and especially in anatomy and other health sciences, mnemonics are everywhere. Whole books have been written about medical mnemonics. And it's helped many of us get through our courses in which a lot of memorization is needed. There are several to help remember the roots, trunks, divisions, chords, and branches theme of the brachial plexus. One that I like is rugby teams drink cold beer. Another more relevant one is read that darn cadaver book. What's confusing about this from the outset, though, in my opinion, is that the roots of the brachial plexus are actually ventral rami. Now, nobody asked me, or that would not be the case with the naming. But the use of the term roots here does not refer to the dorsal and ventral roots that come off the spinal cord and then merge to form a spinal nerve. When talking about the brachial plexus, the ventral rami of spinal nerves C5 to T1 become the origins, in other words, the roots of the plexus itself. Confusing? Yes. But in this case, the roots of the plexus are the ventral rami of spinal nerves C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Now, let's get to the braiding. As for the trunks of the brachial plexus, the ventral rami of C5 and C6 merge, forming what's called the upper trunk of the brachial plexus. Even though upper is not good anatomical terminology, it has more or less stuck. The ventral ramus of C7 stays on its own to form the middle trunk of the brachial plexus. And the ventral rami of C8 and T1 braid together, forming what's called the lower trunk of the brachial plexus, though inferior would be a better anatomical name for it, similar to superior for the upper trunk. Now, as we braid, remember that each spinal nerve is a bundle of axons. That's the transmitting part of a neuron. Nerves, by definition, are bundles of these axons traveling together outside the central nervous system. So when the ventral ramus of C5 and ventral ramus of C6 merge, their axons are not changing. They're just being rebundled into a single new group of the axons that were in the two original ventral rami. The axons from C5 are still from C5, and those from C6 are still from C6. The fibers don't change their nature, they just change their pathway. Sort of like separate colors of yarn in a knit scarf. They come together, but the colors themselves don't change. So the upper trunk is made up of C5 and C6. The middle trunk is unbraided, so it's still C7. And the lower trunk is made of C8 and T1, combining, but again, not changing their nature. The next anatomical facet of the brachial plexus is that each of the three trunks split into an anterior division and a posterior division. What's really happening here is that the braided axons in the upper trunk that came from the ventral rami of spinal nerve C5 and C6 are now being split into an anterior division and a posterior division. Likewise, the ventral ramus of C7, the middle trunk, is also split into an anterior division and a posterior division. And the lower trunk, that's now a combination of the ventral rami of spinal nerve C8 and T1, those are also being distributed into an anterior division and a posterior division. You may be thinking, given that these divisions are splitting off deep in the armpit, why use anterior and posterior? But anterior and posterior not only refer to the side of the limb where these divisions are now headed, but also to the fact that the anterior divisions travel anterior to the axillary artery, which is a major artery of the body that carries blood into the upper limb. The posterior divisions pass posterior to the axillary artery. So at this point, the braiding of the brachial plexus makes a cage of sorts around the axillary artery. As we move distally along the plexus, all three of the posterior divisions, The one from the upper trunk, the one from the middle trunk, and the one from the lower trunk merge to form what's called the posterior cord. Now, the anterior division from the upper trunk and the anterior division from the middle trunk merge to form the lateral cord. And the anterior division from the lower trunk stays on its own, forming the medial cord. So the three cords are lateral, medial, and posterior. Up to this point, the braiding was happening in the neck and then the axilla. But if we consider the outstretched arm, which these cords are now entering, the lateral cord is on the thumb side of the upper limb, which is lateral, and the medial cord is on the little finger side, which is the upper limb's medial aspect. Remember, standard anatomical position freezes those terms in space, no matter what pose we're in. The posterior cord is deep in the axilla, traveling to the posterior aspect of the upper limb. Now, for a quick recap, revisit the mnemonic, read that darn cadaver book. At this cord level, the C word in the memory device, we've reached the last of the braiding or combining of axons. Now the three cords will divide to form the branches of the brachial plexus, the B in the mnemonic. But these so-called branches are actually the 5 main nerves that result at the end of the braiding. Sometimes these are referred to as terminal branches, since they're the termination of the plexus, just like the origins of the plexus were called roots. Calling them terminal branches, though, makes it sound like they're finished. But as we'll see in future lessons, these nerves all have muscular and sensory branches of their own. When the word terminal is applied to these nerves of the brachial plexus, it simply means that the plexus as a network is now complete. The braiding is done. The 5 resulting nerves will supply muscles from the shoulders to the fingertips in the upper limb. In fact, every muscle within the limb itself is supplied by 1 or 2 of these nerves. In my opinion, the posterior cord is easiest to consider first. The posterior cord divides into 2 nerves. One is the axillary nerve that stays in the shoulder region and supplies just 2 muscles, the deltoid and teres minor, which we'll learn about in our next lesson. The other branch off the posterior cord is the much larger radial nerve. Now, the radial nerve is a major nerve that supplies all muscles of the posterior upper limb, both in the arm region, which remember is the area between the shoulder and elbow, and the posterior forearm. The radial nerve contains axons from all ventral rami of the plexus, since it's off the posterior cord, which is a braid of all posterior divisions from each of the trunks. Both the lateral cord and the medial cord each send a branch toward the midline of the plexus, and the resulting nerve is known as the median nerve. This results in a Y-like appearance, in which the 2 arms of the Y are the contributions from the lateral and medial cords, and the stem of the Y is the median nerve. Now remember that median refers to the midline of a structure, and this median nerve comes off the approximate midline of the brachial plexus's more anterior components, which are the lateral and medial cords. The median nerve supplies most muscles in the anterior forearm and some muscles in the palm of the hand. Now the remainder of the lateral cord, after it gives off its contribution to the median nerve, continues on as the musculocutaneous nerve. It supplies the 3 muscles of the anterior arm, including the biceps brachii, which we talked about in previous lessons. The remainder of the medial cord, after giving off its contribution to the median nerve, continues on as the ulnar nerve, which supplies a few muscles in the anterior forearm and most muscles in the palmar hand. Now, let's take a step back and review the brachial plexus as a whole. It forms a palindrome of sorts, like kayak or madam. Those are spelled the same from the left or the right. The brachial plexus is like that with the numbers of its subcomponents. 5 roots, which remember are actually ventral rami, merge to form 3 trunks, upper, middle, and lower, that each split to form 6 divisions, that then merge to form 3 chords, lateral, medial, and posterior, and finally, these split to form 5 terminal branches, which are those resulting nerves: axillary, radial, median, musculocutaneous, and ulnar. So the palindrome is 5, 3, 6, 3, 5. 5 things go to 3 things, which branch to 6 things, that merge to form 3 things, that split again to form 5 things. See, I told you it was complicated, but fascinating. Now I'm ready for a but wait, there's more. The 5 terminal branches are just the main nerves that come off the plexus and head down the upper limb. But as we saw when we looked at the muscles of the superficial back and superficial chest, there are plenty of muscles that help move the upper limb that aren't necessarily located, or at least don't originate in the limb itself. So all along its braiding, the brachial plexus gives off numerous nerves, early birds as I like to call them, to supply muscles that move the scapula, for example, and live on the back, chest, or in the shoulder. These small nerves that supply only 1, 2, or maybe 3 muscles each come off at the brachial plexus's root level, trunk level, or cord level. For instance, the long thoracic nerve comes off at the root level, that is, off of the ventral rami of C5, C6, and C7, and supplies only the serratus anterior muscle. The dorsal scapular nerve also leaves the plexus at the root level and supplies the levator scapulae, rhomboid major, and rhomboid minor. We've mentioned all of those muscles before, and they live on the back or on the chest, even though their job is in the upper limb. 2 nerves come off at the trunk level, specifically off the upper trunk. The nerve to the subclavius supplies, you guessed it, the subclavius muscle. The suprascapular nerve supplies 2 muscles we haven't met yet that are part of the shoulder group known as the rotator cuff. These are the supraspinatus and infraspinatus, which we'll study in our next lesson. Off the posterior cord come 3 early nerves: the upper subscapular nerve, lower subscapular nerve, and between them the thoracodorsal nerve, which used to be called the middle subscapular nerve. The upper subscapular nerve only supplies the subscapularis muscle, another of the rotator cuff muscles. The lower subscapular nerve also supplies the subscapularis, but additionally serves the teres major, which we'll meet in our next lesson. The thoracodorsal nerve supplies only the latissimus dorsi muscle, one of the muscles we met in the superficial appendicular group on the back. Finally, the medial pectoral nerve comes off the medial cord and supplies both the pectoralis major and pectoralis minor. The lateral pectoral nerve comes off the lateral cord and supplies only the pectoralis major. So the pectoralis major gets 2 nerves, the medial and lateral pectoral nerves, while the pectoralis minor gets only the medial pectoral nerve. Now we'll review all this when we cover the muscles, since the brachial plexus supplies nearly all muscles that operate the scapula, clavicle, or any part of the upper limb. In fact, the only muscle of the upper limb not supplied by the brachial plexus is the trapezius, governed by the spinal accessory nerve, a cranial nerve. But here's another fun fact. None of these early bird nerves reach the skin. They only supply muscles on the chest, superficial back, or around the shoulder region. So what about cutaneous nerves to the skin of the upper limb? There are 2 other nerves off the medial cord of the brachial plexus, and these only supply skin, not any muscles at all. These are the medial brachial cutaneous nerve, also known as the medial cutaneous nerve of the arm, and the medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve, which is also called the medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm. These are the only 2 nerves directly off the brachial plexus that solely supply skin. But all of the terminal branches, axillary, radial, musculocutaneous, median, and ulnar nerves. They all have cutaneous branches. These are the reason that the dermatomes of the upper limb are C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. One question my students always ask is why? As in, why is an anatomical feature designed like that? And in terms of anatomy, I'll again paraphrase my favorite quote from The Simpsons. Maybe there is no moral to the story. Maybe it's just a bunch of stuff that happened. Now that said, there may be some method to the braiding madness when it comes to the brachial plexus, or any plexus for that matter. One theory is that evolution favors a certain amount of redundancy. When we consider these nerves that form the 5 branches off the brachial plexus, each nerve includes more than one of those ventral rami. In fact, each terminal branch contains 2, 3, or all 5 of the original roots of the plexus. This overlap in service is protective to a degree, in that if one spinal nerve or one component of the plexus is damaged, other parts may be able to assist, like safety in numbers. And when you think of limbs in an evolutionary sense, think of them as life-saving devices, since they allow animals, including us, to flee from danger or fight an intruder or a predator. And in that fight or flight, those extremities that defend us could be damaged, including the muscles and nerves in those limbs. Nerves, as bundles of axons serving a group of muscles, even contain their own redundancy, since the bundling itself provides duplication, like a rope made out of many individual fibers. In addition, muscles are composed of working units called motor units. These also provide some redundancy. Each motor unit in a muscle is supplied by a single axon, and a motor unit may link a single axon to 1,000 muscle cells. If just one axon is damaged, only that motor unit will be impaired. A single muscle may contain hundreds of motor units to provide some protective redundancy, but also to provide us the variability in strength and movement that each muscle needs simply for our day-to-day activities. Of course, the redundancy can only provide so much backup. If the damage is extensive, the overlap of supply alone cannot compensate. Let's finish up this lesson by talking about pathologies of the brachial plexus. Now, we all know that a small cut to a tiny nerve in the finger heals, whether that cut happens while chopping vegetables or is the result of a surgeon's scalpel blade. Or a clinician might tell you the feeling should come back within a few months. But significant damage, especially within the central nervous system, can result in permanent disability. And as with other nervous system issues, the deficits relate not just to the amount of damage, but also to the specific region of damage. We've talked about dermatomes before. Those are patches of skin supplied by a given nerve. But we haven't yet talked about myotomes. These are groups of muscles that are functionally related by their nerve supply. For instance, muscles that cause lateral rotation and abduction at the shoulder are primarily supplied by nerves that contain C5, while muscles that medially rotate and adduct the upper limb at the shoulder, they're mainly supplied by nerves that contain the ventral rami of C6, C7, and C8. The muscles that allow us to flex our elbow are generally supplied by C5 and C6, while muscles that cause elbow extension are mainly supplied by C6 and C7 spinal nerves, all through that brachial plexus. So we can generalize that damage to the higher spinal cord levels that contribute to the brachial plexus will in turn cause different impairments or damage than lower spinal cord levels. Further, because nerves of the brachial plexus are made up of multiple spinal nerves from multiple spinal cord levels, damage to any one nerve, while leading to some weakness, may not totally impair a person's ability to use a muscle. Any remaining nerve supply will aid in the functioning of those muscles. You might wonder how a person could damage higher spinal cord levels versus lower spinal cord levels. Remember that the brachial plexus roots are composed of the ventral rami C5 to T1. So let's consider a specific case. A young man is playing polo when he falls from his horse. He lands on his right shoulder in such a way that his neck is seriously stretched between his head and shoulder. The stretch between his neck and shoulder would damage which region of the brachial plexus, the upper region or the lower region? If you said the upper portion, you're right. In fact, the C5 spinal nerve, with its ventral ramus that forms the most superior part of the brachial plexus, it could even pull out of the spinal cord itself, which is known as an avulsion. If that happens, certain functions like lateral rotation, abduction, and elbow flexion will be far more affected than their opposing functions of medial rotation, adduction, and elbow extension. Since the spinal cord itself wasn't damaged, this type of injury won't block transmission between the brain and the cord. But if the C5 nerve pulls off from the cord, any muscle supplied by C5 will be compromised. In this case, it could be a muscle of the upper limb or even the respiratory diaphragm, since remember that the phrenic nerve contributed to the diaphragm and it was composed of C3, C4, and C5. With that said, one of the roles of a physical therapist is to help a person learn to use their synergistic muscle groups to aid one or more muscles that's been compromised by an injury. Also, remember that if the C5 nerve pulls out, the dermatome consisting of the patch of skin supplied by C5 will also be affected. There won't be a precise dead zone because there is some overlap between the C5 and C6 supply to the skin, for example, but there will be some areas of numbness along with areas of muscle weakness. In fact, there's a classic presentation of a person with an upper brachial plexus injury. It's known as the waiter's tip position. The upper limb is in medial rotation since lateral rotation is compromised. The elbow is extended. The wrist is stuck in flexion such that the palm is up. Now, the reason this is called the waiter's tip position is because in the old days, when a server did some special service for a customer, the waiter would discreetly put his hand out behind his back so the patron could subtly place a tip in it. Of course, today, tipping isn't so discreet. The amount is sometimes simply put on your bill. Now, how might someone suffer a lower brachial plexus injury? What about a woman who is on a ladder cutting down some dead branches from a tree? Suddenly, the ladder shifts and falls away, and as she loses her footing, she instinctively grabs for a branch, and with a jerk, her upper limb takes the full force of her falling body weight. As a result, she has excessive stretching in her axilla, which will take a toll on the lower regions of the brachial plexus, perhaps the ulnar nerve that comes from C8 and T1. Though her shoulder and elbow won't be affected, she'll lose some function in her hand. Some fingers may be stuck in a claw position, and fine motor control in the hand will be lost, especially in the ring and pinky fingers, which will also typically lose sensation. This is because those are areas governed by the ulnar nerve, as we'll see in future lessons. Another tragic way that an upper or lower brachial plexus injury can occur is at birth. Imagine a situation in which a woman goes into unexpected labor in the back of a bus. The driver or fellow passengers may try to assist, but what if the baby's arm is sticking out of the birth canal and someone grabs the upper limb and pulls? Would that damage the upper or lower regions of the baby's brachial plexus? If you said lower, you're correct. On the other hand, what if the baby's head emerges, but the infant's shoulders seem to be stuck in the birth canal? So an unwitting assistant pulls the baby's head. That would damage the upper areas of the brachial plexus, and as a result, the child will have what's known as Erb's palsy. Either way, the amount of the damage determines the extent of the resulting disability. Now that you have a good understanding of the brachial plexus, let's take this information about the nervous system and study the upper limb regionally, beginning with the shoulder. In our next lesson, we'll study the bones and muscles involved with the shoulder movements and briefly reinforce these innervations along the way.